Hey guys, welcome to Poor Man Mods. Today we're going to be talking about the top 10 modifications for the MK3 Supra that I would recommend for pretty much anybody, regardless of how extreme you want to go with the car. Now, can you believe that I get asked pretty often about recommendations for modifications or even just repairs for this car? So hopefully this video will be helpful to at least a few people, whether you've had the car for a few years or you're thinking about getting a MK3 Supra or you just got one. And some of the things I'm going to talk in this video are simple, just a simple modification, and others are more of a rabbit hole / project, because keep in mind these cars are pretty old, 30 plus years old, and a lot of the components need replacing or upgrading. And sometimes when you think about changing or modifying one component, you get into a case of the while I'm in there's. And a case of the while I'm in there's can often seem like a bad thing or annoying up front. 9 times out of 10, the end result is worth it. On this list of top 10 things I'm going to recommend for MK3 Supras, some of them are just straight up modifications, and some of the other things are rabbit holes, and I have quite the experience with rabbit holes. So with that being said, if you're interested in learning a little bit about the MK3 Supra and you're interested in modifying it, or even interested in some repairs, stay tuned and we're going to talk about a whole bunch of stuff. For the most part, this list is in no particular order. Everybody's car is different in different stages of disrepair or repair. But the first thing I'm going to talk about is, I think, the most important thing, the thing that I want to drive home the most to some people. It's really hard for some people to wrap their head around or commit to. But number one on my list, the number one modification that I would recommend to anybody with a MK3 Supra, anybody, regardless, turbo, non-turbo, automatic, manual, whether it's a daily driver or a full-out race car, I've got to recommend a standalone ECU. Not a piggyback tuner, not a piggyback programmer, none of that crap. I've been there, done that, and I know it sucks. It's a hard pill to swallow, but swallow it. And get yourself a standalone ECU. If you have to, save up for it. I'm knowledgeable about Haltech, and that seems to be the industry standard, at least in my area. Aside from, like, if you're in the Subaru world, that's Cobb, but pretty much if you have a Toyota, a Nissan, pretty much anything that's common to put an aftermarket ECU in, at least in my area, the Mid-Atlantic region, most tuners are familiar with and comfortable with Haltech. You don't want to get something that tuners aren't familiar with, especially if you're not going to tune it. You want to get something that a knowledgeable tuner is comfortable with, because you want the best end result. There's a bunch of other names out there, but what I would recommend, I'm partial to Haltech, but if you have a particular tuner that you like or a performance shop that you like, ask them what they're comfortable with and then go from there. But some of the main reasons why I think it's so important to go with a standalone ECU for your MK3 Supra, number one is reliability. Now, full disclosure, I have practically no experience with the 7M world. When I got my MK3 Supra, it was a shell, and I immediately went to JZ. So I don't have any experience with the 7M or the ECUs or anything like that, but in the JZ world, it's very common for the capacitors on the ECU to fail. The ECUs are unreliable. I went through 2 or 3 1JZ ECUs before I finally went to a standalone. That's looking pretty good. After about putting, 10 hollow points through it, let's see if it works. So that's my ECU that is shot to shit with the Gritty E manage hooked up. See if it starts. It works! All it it needs some lead. The worst thing that you can do is have what you think is a perfectly solid, capable car, and it leave you stranded somewhere, which my car did multiple times because of the ECU. What's really cool about the Haltech that I have, it even has OBD2 capability, so I can hook up a scan tool. This Supra now has check engine light codes. I can do data logging through OBD2 devices. Super freaking cool stuff that the factory ECU couldn't. Do not do a piggyback programmer like an Apexi Neo or a Greddy eManage. Skip all that crap, save the money and headache, save up for a standalone ECU, and bite the bullet. You won't regret it. Modification number 2 that I recommend goes along with a standalone ECU, but it's not entirely required to have a standalone ECU for it, and that is upgrading the ignition coils to 1ZZ coils. There's a couple different coil options you could go to. 1ZZs are really popular, but basically why I recommend upgrading your ignition coils, whether you have a 7M or a 1JZ, is for one, reliability. Like I said, the stock components on these cars are 30 years old. Going to a newer, modern part device is going to be more reliable, but also easier to find. But they're more powerful. They're going to give you, a little bit more power. But what I really noticed, as soon as I plugged in my 1ZZ coils and my 1JZ, after my buddy Ron from Yoda Connectors wired them up for me, it started so much easier and the idle was better. I was getting just so much better performance from daily driving stuff. It really made driving the car a lot more manageable. Like, it was a serious upgrade. But seriously, in terms of just reliability and performance, there's no downside to this. Whether you have an ECU, whether you have an aftermarket ECU or not, I do highly recommend doing this upgrade. It will be probably slightly easier to do it if you have a standalone ECU, because they are designed to power ignition coils directly, unlike the stock ECU, which likes to communicate with an igniter, and then that communicates to the coils. So, mod number 2, ignition coils. Modification number 3, sorry for you automatic transmission people, but modification number 3 is a short shifter, specifically the cube short shifter. I've had this thing for a few years, and oh my God, I freaking love it. It feels so freaking good. Absolutely love the way that it shifts. But also, even though it's long, the shifts are super, super short. Every time somebody drives the car, they're amazed with how short the throws are. There's nothing really wrong with the factory shifter. I don't think there's any, real failure points, but just having that shifter and the way that it feels makes driving the car so much more enjoyable. And it's definitely one of my favorite modifications that I've done to the car. It's something that you constantly touch and something that you constantly get to enjoy. Some modifications, kind of go unnoticed, but that short shifter, every time you change a gear, you get to enjoy it, and I highly recommend it. So number 3, short shifter, specifically the cube short shifter. And please don't cheap out, and if you are interested in the cube one, don't get the cheap $50 eBay one. Those things are absolute junk. I can't tell you how many people have bought them and then tell me that they bought it and how shitty it is, and they say that it's a cube shifter, but it's not. So please refrain from buying the $50 cube shifter. It's not good. There's plenty of people that can attest to that. If you're gonna get a short shifter and you're gonna get a cube, get the original from their website. You're not going to regret it. Modification number 4, but this one is definitely a rabbit hole, and that's the fuel system. For this video, I'm talking about the wiring, the fuel pump, the filter, and the lines. The first thing that you gotta do, very common talk on the forums and the Facebook page, is the 12-volt mod. Apparently, in stock form, these cars, they send a 6-volt signal and a 12-volt signal to the fuel pump. So the fuel pump has like 2 different speeds, which can cause some issues and it can be unreliable. And since most of us go for more power, we need more fuel all the time, so we opt to just send full power to the fuel pump, and it just makes it more reliable. When I first did this engine swap, I just ran my own wiring for the fuel pump, but the wiring was already pretty messed up from when I got it. But your fuel pump could be 30 years old or more. So I would recommend dropping the tank, and while you're in there, take a look at your fuel tank straps. They might need addressed. When you drop the tank, look at your filler neck. I wouldn't recommend, a lot of people cut the hole in their trunk. I don't know how I feel about that. I wouldn't recommend it. As some of the bad stuff that I've done, it's really not that big of a deal to drop the tank. Unless for some reason you can't, I really would recommend just dropping the tank, and that'll let you inspect the fuel tank straps, see if they're in decent condition, inspect the filler neck and the gasket for that, see if any of that needs work. And while the tank is down, you can clean it up. If it's rusty, de-rust it, spray it with some bed liner or undercoating and protect it. Take the stock fuel pump out, regardless of what your power level is, and put a new pump in it. It's 30 years old at this point, or could be 30 years old. It's time for an upgrade. You can put a modern pump in it, whether it's a stock flow rate or like a Walbro 255 or a 440 or whatever your power goals are. Put a nice fuel pump in there. They really aren't that expensive. And while you're in there, seriously, change out the fuel filter. Toyota claims that this is a lifetime fuel filter, and they're not wrong. Every filter is lifetime, and also every fluid is lifetime. It just depends on how long you want its associated device to last. But I did post a video last year of me taking apart my lifetime fuel filter. It only had 100,000 miles on it. Amazingly, it was still able to produce 500 horsepower, as bad as it looked. At only 100,000 miles, and granted it's 30 years old, it was completely filled of, I don't even know what it was. It looked like kidney stones, and I don't even know how it was flowing anything. The fuel filters are super cheap, but unfortunately, the fuel lines, at least mine, did not look the best. Instead of replacing the factory filter with another factory filter, I really didn't trust the factory fuel line and banjo bolt setup. So I went to an Aeromotive fuel filter and then ran my own AN line all the way from the filter to the rail, and then ran my own rubber return hose from the fuel pressure regulator all the way back to the tank. And chances are, unless your car has been garage kept in Arizona or California, chances are your fuel lines don't look great either. You may even want to consider replacing the fuel pump hanger if you can find one. I really didn't trust the metal lines coming out of the top of mine, and I replaced it last year for my trip to Supras in Vegas. Mine were pretty rusty. There's a lot of things in the fuel system that they don't get cleaned. When salt and debris sit on them for years and years, it can do a lot of damage. So it is quite the rabbit hole, but totally worth it. And after you go through all that pain and all that agony of doing all that with the fuel system, it'll suck while you're in there, but I promise when you're finished with it, you'll feel a whole lot better, and it'll give you a whole lot more confidence about the car. For mod number 5, unless you're going for a concourse restoration, I've got to say, I highly recommend doing a good head unit, upgrading your speakers, and doing some kind of subwoofer, like an underseat subwoofer, which I did in my Supra here. The factory head unit, most of us don't have them anymore. They are becoming more popular with people into the retro stuff. Chances are, if you have one, they don't even work properly. They are super cool, and if you do have one, and if it works, I do recommend keeping it because, the retro nostalgia of it. Most of us who have acquired a Mark III Supra probably have a shitty 90s Pioneer or JVC head unit in it. I personally put a double DIN Atoto Android head unit in my Mark III Supra. And Atoto sounds super China and junky, and I have 4 of them now in my vehicles, and seriously, I love it. Head unit technology has come a long way, as long as you don't get Kenwood, Pioneer, or JVC. Their technology hasn't changed in 15 years. Seriously, don't buy their junk. You're gonna spend $1,000 on a Kenwood head unit and get the same thing that you would have bought 10 years ago. Don't do it. I have an Atoto head unit in the Supra, and it was like $120, double DIN, wireless CarPlay, wireless Android Auto. It can do screen mirroring. You can put the torque app on it. So with my Haltech ECU in my Mark III Supra and the torque app on my Android head unit, I can pull up more gauges and do data logging on my freaking head unit. It is super cool. And the internal amplifier of this head unit, I'm sure other head units too, but was so good that simply just by installing this head unit and not even adjusting the equalizer made all the speakers sound better. So much better. And with this car, with having the racing seat and the harness and the cage and the window tint, backing up at night,
You can't see fucking shit out of this thing.
and having a backup camera is so freaking helpful. Even though my hydraulic handbrake and shifter block 50% of the screen, I can still look over while backing up, and the backup camera helps out so much. It is so worth installing a backup camera in this car. Subwoofers have come a long way too. You can get, subwoofer amplifier combos that are really small. I have a under-seat subwoofer amplifier combo in my Supra. I highly recommend going down that rabbit hole of head unit speakers and a subwoofer. My opinion, totally worth it. For a while, I was against it, but now that I did it to this car about a year and a half ago, absolutely love it and made the driving experience so much more enjoyable. And I got to enjoy it a whole lot when I drove this car all the way across America and back last year. Mod number 6 is probably going to be a surprise to you, but that is a clutch master cylinder upgrade. And I'm sure most of you with a manual transmission are going to upgrade the clutch at some point in your life. So what I ran into when I initially put my transmission in the car, I had a spec stage 4 clutch, and what happened was it kept blowing out my master cylinder and slave cylinder. At first, it blew out the slave cylinder because the added pressure of the clutch. And so I replaced the slave cylinder. So having a robust pressure plate and then a brand new robust slave cylinder, the master cylinder blew out, the original Toyota master cylinder. Put a new ISIN or ASIN, however you say it, put a new ASIN clutch master cylinder in there, and that blew out. Put another one in there, and that blew out. And that one lasted a little bit longer. It got me thinking, the heavier clutch, the stock master cylinder just, I guess, wasn't designed for the increased pressure. And I went to a Willwood clutch master cylinder with a bigger bore, and holy crap, it's been a lot more reliable, and it's honestly not that expensive. And it looks cool. You get a nice Willwood piece in your engine bay. The master cylinder itself was not that expensive. I want to say around the time that I did it was like $100. And then you have to get an adapter bracket to make the master cylinder fit the MK3 Supra firewall. There's a couple different companies out there that make that. And I actually did a video on doing this upgrade. But when you do it, because the new master cylinder has a bigger bore and it flows more fluid, it's even easier to push the clutch pedal, and you don't even have to push it as far. The action of the pedal, since it's moving so much fluid, it is easier to move the slave cylinder and the pressure plate, and makes it just easier to operate the clutch. So you're gonna get more reliability, it's gonna look cooler, and it's gonna make your clutch easier to operate if you have an extreme clutch. Even if you have a stock clutch right now, if you upgrade the clutch master cylinder now, you are going to future-proof it. You could pretty much put any clutch in there. And since upgrading my clutch master cylinder, I have had 0 problems with the slave cylinder. So apparently that can handle the increased pressure, but the stock clutch master just couldn't. This next one, number 7, is another one of my favorites, and that's an aluminum drive shaft. Whether you have an automatic or a manual transmission, I think this is a good upgrade. You're probably gonna see more of a benefit if you have a manual transmission. I've never done this on an automatic transmission car, but when I did it on my Supra and also my IS300, I went with a Shaftmasters aluminum drive shaft, a 3-inch aluminum drive shaft. Shaftmasters lists the MK3 Supra's drive shaft on their website, so you can go there and click add to cart and buy it right now, and it's pretty dang affordable for what it is, honestly. What I noticed right upon installing it, it's kind of hard to describe, but I just noticed that the power, it just felt like it was so much quicker and easier to get the rear wheels to spin and break loose. Like the power getting sent to the rear wheels with the lighter drive shaft was just so much quicker, and it really just woke the car up and made it feel a lot snappier. And theoretically, it does improve fuel economy, but if you're gonna be driving the car harder because it's more fun, you're definitely not gonna see an improvement, but the drop in rotational mass theoretically improves fuel economy, but we're probably gonna see an improvement of power to the ground because of the reduced weight. We're probably not gonna see improved fuel economy. But it gets rid of the center carrier bearing, which can be a point of failure also. But being that it does that, you do want to install a drive shaft loop, which I have not done yet, but it is recommended. But going to a lightweight aluminum drive shaft, depending on your power level, it's going to improve reliability. It's going to get rid of that center bearing and replace your old U-joints. It's going to make the car snappier and feel a lot more fun, improve how much power is getting to the ground. If you're a big power car, obviously steel drive shaft, but mid to low power, aluminum all the way for sure. So you can't go wrong with making the car more fun and more reliable. Day 2 of this video, my camera died and then I had to go to work. Modification number 8 that we're going to be talking about is, of course, brakes, front and rear. The MK3 Supra is not the lightest car in the world. Even if you do a little bit of weight reduction, I did a lot of weight reduction with this car and it still weighs over 3,100 pounds. So they're pretty heavy cars, way heavier than an S13 or a Fox body Mustang, you know, similar cars of that era. And the brakes are definitely not up to the task for the stock power level. They do not feel good. Stock brakes, stock power, and especially if you go to increased power. Now for the front brakes, there are a couple different options out there. There's the Mercedes brake upgrade that you can do, which I've done a video on. Some people also do the Cobra front brakes, which I don't know much about that. But there are a couple different front brake upgrades that you can do before dropping bank on a Willwood kit. When you upgrade the brakes, there really are 3 main benefits that you get from it. Of course, you get the increased stopping power, which is for safety. These cars are heavy, and if you're gonna increase power, you absolutely need more stopping power, especially up front. It's most important that you upgrade the front brakes over the rear. Of course, the rear is helpful too, but most of your braking is done up front, so you wanna focus on the front first. If you go to like a 4 or 6 piston style brake caliper, you're also going to improve reliability. Single piston calipers with slides, they can tend to seize up. It really is recommended that you do it. The stock brakes just simply are not that good. And if they're 30 years old, it's probably time to replace them anyway. So why not upgrade them at the same time and get better looks, better stopping power, and better reliability. And for the rear, there are not many options out there. I think before you go to a really expensive Willwood kit, the only other option out there is the rear brake kit that I developed that lets you run an LS430 rear brake caliper. So if you're in the market to upgrade the rear brakes on your MK3 Supra, I make and sell adapter brackets to bolt a 2-piston Lexus LS430 rear caliper to the car. Looks freaking awesome. You get a much bigger rotor, better stopping power, and of course, more reliability. So win-win all the way around. There's pretty much no drawback to upgrading the brakes. Highly recommend it regardless of how often you drive the car and your power level. Next thing we're gonna be talking about is a bit of a rabbit hole, but that is control arms and control arm bushings. Now I've said this plenty of times before, but these cars are very old, and regardless if they're high mileage or not, chances are the rubber in the control arm bushings are either worn from high mileage or they're just dry rotted from being old. I would highly recommend, it's not something that you need to rush into doing, it's not something that needs to be done next weekend if you own the car, but one thing that I really would suggest is doing a control arm bushing kit and or also replacing some of the control arms. A couple years ago, I did strong flex control arm bushings all around this car and also subframe bushings. The subframe bushings, I don't think are that necessary to do unless it's something you really want to do, but the control arm bushings definitely get way more worn and way more abuse than the subframe bushings. I also have Techno Toy Tuning rear control arms on this car, which eliminate a lot of the bushings. So whether you do control arm replacements or just control arm bushings or a conjunction of the two, going down this rabbit hole and opening up this can of worms is something that I really would recommend doing for a couple reasons. Whether you've had this car for a while or you're new to it, if you get a whole control arm bushing kit, it is quite the rabbit hole. The car's gonna be off the road for quite a while. I would be impressed if you could do it in under a week. That would be quite impressive. It took me a long time to do the control arm bushing kit. You're gonna run into a case of the while I'm in there's, and while you're in there, the process is probably going to suck and be excruciating, but the end result is gonna be worth it. While you're in there, you're probably gonna find a lot more things that could be addressed, that could be improved. You might find some rust that you need to fix. You might find some other components that are bad or might need replaced. And You're probably gonna run into some cam bolts that are stuck and need to be cut out and replaced, but you're gonna run into a lot of hiccups throughout the entire project. All those things have to be resolved anyway. But by doing like a whole control arm bushing kit, you're gonna be finding all these problems, touching a whole bunch of components. You're gonna learn a lot about the car. And after you fix all those roadblocks and fix everything that is in disrepair or super rusty or needs replaced, you're gonna have a lot more confidence in the car, and the car is gonna be more reliable and drive a whole lot better. So whether you just do control arm bushings or you replace the control arms entirely, like what I did with Technoid Toy Tuning rear control arms, it's just gonna make the car better and more reliable. One other thing that I would recommend that goes along with this rabbit hole is for the rear upper control arms, the reason that ball joint fails is because it's non-serviceable and you can't grease it. I would highly recommend one of the first things you should do to this car, as long as the ball joint is still okay, if you can remove that ball joint from the knuckle and it doesn't have any slop in it, if it still feels good, carefully drill and tap the top of that ball joint and put a Zerk fitting in it and flush it with new grease and have new grease in it. And that'll keep it going for a whole lot longer. It costs a few dollars to do, and it adds serviceability to that ball joint, and it's gonna make it last a lot longer. That's one of those rabbit hole things, you know, while you're in there, while you do the control arm bushings on that upper control arm, while you have it out of the car, drill and tap it, add a grease fitting in there, flush the grease out of that ball joint, and then after you do that, you'll pretty much have a brand new upper control arm, as long as the plastic inside that ball joint isn't already destroyed. So if you do all that, it's quite the process, excruciating. The car will likely be down for a good while, but the end result will be worth it. It'll be more reliable, more enjoyable to drive, more predictable, and likely a lot safer. All right, number 10, I have to shamelessly plug myself again, and that is upgrading the headlights. Now, there are a ton of different headlight upgrade options at this point for, it's not just the Mark III Supra, any vehicle with a 6x4 seal beam headlight or H6054, whatever you want to call it. But I put together what I think is a really nice headlight kit for this car. The factory headlights, if anyone still has them, all cars from the 80s, those factory seal beam headlights are absolutely garbage. They look bad, just the color themselves look terrible, and the light output is absolutely atrocious. But what I do like is the glass lens that they have. Now, there are a ton of different headlight options out there, tons of different flavors and colors and brightnesses, but I put together what I think is a really nice kit for this car. It's a headlight housing with a glass lens with a projector LED bulb inside it, but the projector is really small. It doesn't look all crazy alien-eye like my previous headlights. So makes the car look awesome while maintaining a more retro or classic look, and makes it safer to drive by putting out a ton more light with a super bright low and high beam. So yeah, number 10, upgraded headlights. Of course, I prefer the headlight kit that I put together, but there are so many other options out there, and most of them are better than the factory seal beam bulbs, which are only slightly better than a candle. I hope you found this video enjoyable or educational. Hopefully it helps you or somebody out. If you have a question on any of these modifications, chances are I have a video related to these. Unless it's 7M related, I really don't have much experience with the 7M. But that was my pick for the top 10 modifications for the Mark III Supra. But don't get it confused. Those are not my top 10 favorite modifications that I've done to my Mark III Supra. That will be in a different video. So hope you guys enjoyed this video. Hope you learned something. We'll see you next time. Thanks.